Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you again this morning. I'm going to begin this morning with a story that was written by the Reverend Reverend Chris Bice. And as many stories are, it is both fictional and very, very true. In the story, there was once a beautiful and powerful tiger. But one day she was captured by an evil man who put her in a cage. And the man kept this cage in the jungle, close to where he lived, close to his house. And every day he would visit the tiger to give her a bowl of fresh water and a little bit of food. And sometimes the tiger would look at her own reflection in that fresh bowl of water and she would say, "My, you must be a beautiful tiger." But when the man would hear her say this, he would lie to her and say, "Oh no, you are not a beautiful tiger. You are very ugly. You are, in fact, a very pitiful creature." And sadly, the tiger would believe the man. Some days after she ate her food, she would pace back and forth in her little cage, and she would begin to feel the strength and the suppleness of her muscles, and she would say to herself, "My, you must be a very powerful tiger." But when the man heard her, he would lie to her and say, "No, you are weak and puny. You are such a pitiful creature." And sadly, the tiger would believe the man. But then one day the man was nowhere around and a lion happened to walk by the cage. The lion saw the tiger inside and he asked, "Beautiful and powerful tiger, what are you doing lying around in that cage?" The tiger said, "Please don't make fun of me. I know that I am neither beautiful or powerful." "I'm not making fun of you," said the lion. "You are, in fact, the most beautiful, the most powerful tiger I've ever seen. But I'm just really surprised that you're lying there in that cage when you're clearly strong enough to break yourself out of there." "You really think I could do that?" said the tiger. "I don't know why not," said the lion. Well, the tiger was not quite so sure, but because she had been told so many times how puny she was. But suddenly, it felt as if she could feel that energy, that power forging through her body. And she began to pace back and forth inside that tiny cage. And all of a sudden, almost as an afterthought, she leaped against the door and it sprang open. Out she fell, and being kind of dazed, she said, "Oh my gosh, that door, it didn't even have a lock on it. All that time I've been spending in there, and I could have been free all along." The lion looked at her with her soft brown eyes, and she said, "Those kinds of traps don't need locks. For it is the lies that we believe that keep us in our cages. And it is the truth that sets us free." The end. I am a woman who has always loved stories. And in fact, that is one of the things that I have always loved about being a minister, listening to people's stories. I was blessed to be raised in a family that loved to tell stories. And many Sunday afternoons, when our family gathered as a regular thing, especially in the summer, my cousins would be outside playing. And You'd be able to find me in the kitchen listening to the stories that my aunts and my grandmother and my mother would tell about my dad's side of the family. My favorite storyteller was my Aunt Dorothy. She was the youngest of my dad's siblings, and she had lots of stories about my dad. In particular, I remember her telling the story about once when she hid under the rumble seat of his car when he was out on a date. And it gave me a brand new perspective about my dad. These kinds of stories can be wonderful kinship building rituals. The telling and the retelling of family stories can strengthen bonds. They can help us belong more strongly to places, to people, embedding us in a network of various kinds of connections. But as our story this morning suggests, not all stories are benign, right? There are some family stories, in fact, some early stories that we are told, or at least the way that we interpret the stories that we hear, that can become our cages. And when that happens, it's not only the truth that can set us free, it is often a friendly lion that is required to help us see that truth. A few years ago, I began studying a really powerful tool for self-understanding called the Enneagram. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but the Enneagram is a type of personality indicator that divides humans into 9 different personality types. Its modern use is a combination of both some historical, traditional wisdom traditions and also modern psychology. And the core of the Enneagram is that each and every one of us is born into a state of original blessing. But as we developed and we find that we can't get all of our needs met, all of our immediate needs met by our caregivers, we began to form a story about ourselves to explain why our caregivers won't or can't give us what we believe we need. This is the beginning of ego development, of the story that we believe about ourselves, sometimes reinforced by our caregivers, that we are not, in fact, beautiful and powerful creatures, that we have some sort of flaw. And this is why we can't get our needs met. Nobody escapes this process. We distort the truth about ourselves, or as one of my mentors, Rick Putnam, puts it, it's as if we were cut out right, but then we sew ourselves up wrong. Each of us has a particular snake in our Garden of Eden, in other words, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to correct that broken place to find ourselves back in the garden again. We don't have the time to really discuss the Enneagram this morning, but I just want to briefly say that Carl Jung and others have suggested that each type depends upon a distorted story that we tell ourselves, and then we each have our own ways of trying to correct it. The stories, the 9 stories include: I am defective, I am unlovable, I am worthless, I am insignificant, I am incompetent, I am unimportant, I am inconvenient, I am defenseless, and finally, I am inferior. Now, if any of these statements resonate in a way with you, maybe cause you to catch a little bit in your throat, it might be an indication of what your Enneagram type is. I happen to be a type 7, and so the cage that I continually need to struggle against is the idea that I am inconvenient. From my earliest days, the family story that was told about my gestation and my early days of life happened to be about how inconvenient I was for my mother. She was a farm wife with 2 raucous preschoolers already, and her pregnancy with me had to be handled very carefully. She spent much of her pregnancy on bed rest, and then so there were lots of things that she couldn't get done while she carried me. And in the weeks to follow, when I was born early. And so, I absorbed these stories about how inconvenient that was for my family and for my mother. I know this is a distortion of the truth, but it is my type. It is the thing that I bump up against all the time. What is your story that you grew up with? What does your particular cage look like? Because we all have them. When I first came out as a lesbian woman at the age of 40 or so, this life change was seemed to be particularly inconvenient for my family of origin. Parker Palmer writes that when we begin to notice a strong difference in the families or in the communities that we are a part of, and this was a place where there became a very strong difference. When that happens, then we need to seek out what he calls communities of congruence, places where similar stories are shared, where you're not judged harshly for the new story that is developing in your life. And you often know that you've found such a place when you can hear a phrase or a story that resonates so closely with your own that you just, you kind of stop and you go, wow, me too. That sounds like my story. And you're suddenly reminded, just for that moment, who you really are and what it is you really believe in. When I came out, I yearned for a community of congruence, someplace that would not find me inconvenient. And I found that as I got more acquainted with the LGBTQ community, I found also that in that community, there was kind of a rite of passage of telling your coming out story. Someone would come up to you and say, or start a conversation with you and then say, when did you first know? And in telling that story, whether you were gay, bi, trans, lesbian, whatever, however you were defining yourself, as you told that story, you became part of the tribe. And it became a safe place to tell that story, right? And as I became more comfortable telling my story in that safe space, a strange thing happened. It gave me the courage to tell that same story in less safe spaces, right? This is what a community of congruence can do for us. You tell your story, your particular truth, over and over in this safe space so that you can then go out into less safe spaces and tell it and be less vulnerable in those less welcoming spaces. And that brings me to another story. When I started seminary, when I first started seminary training, I spent my first year at the Duke Divinity School before I transferred to Meadville Lombard in Chicago. I spent a year at Duke taking all of my Judeo-Christian classes. And that year, there was a pretty vicious controversy going on about whether they were going to allow same-sex unions in Duke Chapel. And the divinity school that I was in had come out formally against that practice. One of the professors there had actually said to me one day that he considered it a desecration of sacred space to allow same-sex couples to celebrate in the chapel. And so Duke University became one of those unwelcoming places for me that year. Well, a few weeks into our first fall semester, we were assigned to small spiritual formation groups. Each group had 5 or 6 students and a spiritual director. This was supposed to be kind of our support group for the year. We would meet each week, and our spiritual director was a local Methodist minister. The first time we met, he asked each of us to describe our faith background and then to tell a little bit about our personal lives. Well, I thought I might as well get this over with and tell my story, right? So I told them about spending my early years as a Southern Baptist, which was my mother's tradition. And then I was confirmed as a Missouri Synod Lutheran, because that was my dad's tradition. And that finally I found my way to my spiritual home as a Unitarian Universalist. And once I told that story, then I talked about my 2 grown children and my girlfriend. And I kind of steadied myself, waiting for that question. The room got very quiet. And finally, our spiritual director asked, "So, when did you first know that you were a Unitarian Universalist?" In her poem, Telling, Laura Hershey beautifully captures the vulnerability many of us feel, but also the importance of telling your story. She writes, "What you risk telling your story. You will bore them. Your voice will break. Your ink spill and stain your coat. No one will understand. Their eyes become fences. You will park yourself forever on the outside, your differentness once and for all revealed, dangerous. The names you give to yourself will become epithets. Your happiness will be called bravery or denial. Your sadness will justify their pity. Your fear will magnify their fears. Everything you say will prove something about their God or their economic system. Your feelings that change day to day, kaleidoscopic, will freeze in place, brand you forever, justify anything they decide to do with you. Those with power can afford to tell their story or not. Those without power risk everything to tell their story and must. Somewhere, someone will hear your story and decide to fight, to live, and refuse compromise. Someone else will tell her own story, risking everything. My friends, we need our communities of congruence to feel whole, to correct those broken and distorted images we've created for ourselves or that others may have created for us. We need our brown-eyed lions. What that Methodist minister helped me realize that day as our group met at Duke for the first time was that indeed Unitarian Universalism had become, for me, another place, a community of congruence from which I could be less vulnerable and begin to be more brave. As you all begin to look forward to meeting again this summer in person, I suggest that you might want to take the time to consider what it is about this community that nourishes you and validates you, that allows it to be your community of congruence for you. You may want to even ask each other, when did you first know you were a Unitarian Universalist? Doing so might remind you of why you are here and what you share together. My hope for you is that the UU story that you tell will be healing and transforming for you. That the stories you hear from others serve as mirrors for your own soul. And that finally there are always, always lovely brown-eyed lions in your life that can guide you back to your true home. May it be so, and blessed be.